Welcome. Welcome to the 2019 annual Tinning Lecture. The Tinning Memorial Lecture was established in 2009 by Fred Tinning, one of our former presidents, and his wife Janet, as a special lecture to inspire the students in the osteopathic profession. And this year we have Dr. Fred Schwartz, who currently is down at SOMA. He's a 1969 graduate of KCUM, so this is his 50th year, and we're so sad that he couldn't be here in person to give this presentation and his golfing presentation on Saturday. We are going to miss that one too. But he agreed to present via Zoom, even though he's got so much stuff going on kind of urgently at home. So Dr. Schwartz is board certified family practice, and his practice began in Maine. And because practice wasn't enough work, he helped found University of New England's College of Osteopathic Medicine. He was one of the founding members of that College of Osteopathic Medicine, and then served as the founding Associate Dean and Chair for Community Medicine. He's received so many different awards for his service and advocacy to the osteopathic profession, including making sure that insurance companies and Medicare actually reimburse us for doing osteopathic manipulative medicine. After 15 years in Maine, I guess he got bored, so then he went to the Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine because he needed more work to do, where there he helped establish Midwestern University. In the same way that KCUM used to be just KCUM, CCUM just used to be CCOM, and now they're Midwestern University in the way we're AT Still University. Then he went down to Arizona, where he helped establish their Arizona College of Osteopathic Medicine, Midwestern's sister college down in Arizona. Is that your dog, Dr. Schwartz? So he worked in Arizona until he retired in 2008, and he retired for a grand total of 2 weeks. And then he went and worked at SOMA, our sister college, and where he's serving as the Associate Dean for Clinical Education, which is probably the hardest job at almost any of the comms, and helps work with the community training programs that SOMA uses and that we also use as part of our training programs for the 3rd and 4th year. So I want to thank Dr. Schwartz for attending via Zoom, and here he goes to inspire you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure. Can people hear me okay? Okay, great. One minor correction. I tried to quit again as Associate Dean for Clinical Education, and we made a deal. So I'm now the Senior Advisor to the Dean, Dr. Jeff Morgan, at the school, and Dr. Sharon Obadia is doing a spectacular job as the current Associate Dean for Clinical Education at SOMA. So there are a lot of dignitaries and other folks hanging around and on YouTube, and I'm going to ignore all of them and talk to this class, if I can get my slides to work. That's nice. Okay, so I may disappear for a second here while I try and get the slides to actually function. Lovely. I apologize. Technology can sometimes be a problem. Can you folks see me or hear me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you. And we see your
And
first
can you
slide.
see the slide? You
Well, we
can see
did.
the slides.
We saw your slide and then it disappeared.
Okay, do you see it now?
No. Yes.
Oh, good. All right, I'm so relieved. Okay, so no conflicts of interest, no medications discussed, no FDA approvals needed. Here's what I want to talk about. Where were we? Where are we going? What's it mean for you folks as you start the next at least 50 years of your career? Where does osteopathic medicine fit in today's world of practice? And is there still a role for osteopathic manual medicine in the world of evidence-based medicine as we go forward? This fellow, Robert De Niro, wonderful actor. In 1976, Bobby De Niro starred in a movie called Taxi Driver and delivered a line that people have played back to him every single day of his life, according to De Niro, after that. And that line was, "You talking to me?" He delivered it facing a mirror in the middle of the night. He was a taxi driver with unrecognized PTSD after serving in the war. And the movie itself is really a great movie about how life can fall apart when you're under the stress of social determinants that are not going your way. But in any case, you folks, OMS ones, the folks in this room, you're the ones I want to talk to. And I had this older picture of De Niro, and then I found one of De Niro in 1976 when he was doing Taxi Driver. And just for kind of the same picture, that's me in 1969 in the graduation photo. So anyway, both Bobby De Niro and I have had 50 years of rough road going forward, and so has the osteopathic profession. So if you take a look at us and kind of make a global assessment, Meyer and Price did this in 1993 and did a really good survey of who we are and what we're doing. Basically from 1892, when Dr. Still got us going, till 1950, we were essentially a manual medicine profession. It's kind of what we did, and we were darn good at it. The 1919 flu epidemic really got us on the map because we saved lives when other people couldn't. And we existed mainly in the area of manual medicine until about 1950. Starting in the 50s, there was a big push for us to be more comprehensive. KCOM was a big part of that, and family medicine and rural clinics became kind of the key in a real change in how DOs were viewed, especially in those states we had some presence like Missouri and Michigan, California, but it was mainly manual medicine and family practice that was our hallmark. And then around 1971, the walls in hospitals that were allopathic in nature began to break down. And in California, until the amalgamation there took the DOs and gave them MD certificates for no particular reason, in Michigan, in Ohio, and in New York, a couple of places, DOs began to enter into residencies in allopathic institutions on a one-off kind of a basis at first, and we developed a higher percentage of specialists in those institutions, many of whom came back and in the osteopathic hospitals founded and developed really excellent, outstanding subspecialty and specialty programs with residencies and fellowships. And from the 70s to the present, we really have had a tremendous enhancement and presence in that environment. And then from about 2018 to the present, as you know, we've had the amalgamation of our residency programs into a single ACGME accreditation process. This is something that was attempted twice before, And the real inside scoop on that is that it was the staffs of congressional committees that really put pressure on both groups, saying to them, you guys need to be together. There really is a significant benefit to having one postgraduate system rather than two. Let's see if you guys can do it. If you can't, we'll kind of do it through legislation. And suddenly we came together, and we have succeeded, I think, in getting a new process in place that is going to be good for everyone. Although, as Dr. Gevitz has said, sometimes getting what you ask for is not the same thing as getting what you wish for. And there's still a lot of risk in front of us in the development of these training programs. But overall, we have the ability to point to the fact that we have made significant positive progress. So where are we as DOs? Well, we're part of the mix of medicine in an extremely real way. Medicine is still having lots of problems, both in the US and around the world, but we can point to the fact that in the whole world, immunization rates have gone up significantly. The number of people who are dying of diseases that we can easily cure has gone down significantly, but is still a pretty big number. You've got about 1 billion people on this planet who are not receiving simple preventive services and still at risk of dying of things like appendicitis, ruptured gallbladders, obstetrical disasters. We got a lot of work left to do. We also have a lot of work left to do inside the United States. But the profession itself is probably a lot better off than it was certainly the 50 years ago. We shake our heads and look at the progress and we're amazed by it. And we're making a very significant contribution. During that 50 years that my colleagues and I were in practice, the profession went from 5 schools to 35 schools with 55 locations, 55 individual programs. And so this year, 1 in 4 of the entering medical students in the US is in fact a DO student. And we can point to the ACGME single accreditation as a positive outcome of our significant presence. We matter in medicine now where we might not have mattered much before. But the question that we have to ask, as you especially as first-year students begin to wrap your heads around the osteopathic concept, is whether or not in the process we've ended up looking just like everybody else. And as Vincent van Gogh said, I put my heart and soul in my work and I lost my mind. Do we in fact still have a rationale for why we are different? Are we all the same? Well, we spent the first 20 years practicing in an environment where not every place in the country did we have full practice rights. That didn't happen until 1969. We're fighting a good fight to keep osteopathic distinction alive inside the common residency programs. So we have 2 separate professions for medical students, certainly, and for some practitioners. But if you really dig in and you analyze what it is that still makes a difference, whether you use Myers-Briggs or some other analyses, what you'll find is that a higher percentage of DOs than MDs see themselves as social and emotional rather than technological practitioners, regardless of the specialties that we're in. And I think that comes from our deans and our faculty, and certainly Dr. Wilson and Dr. Morgan are leaders in these areas, understanding that human beings taking care of human beings need to have very strong skills and understanding in social and emotional areas. These differences may be subtle, but they are incredibly important. So look at us in the context of the United States as you begin to think about where the DOs fit. As a nation, we cost a lot more for medical care, and despite the braggadocio that you hear, we are not the best in our outcomes. We're about in the middle of the G20 developed nations, despite what we spend. Inside the United States, we've got 30 million underinsured and uninsured people whose lifespan and whose quality of life are actually reduced. So what right do we have to exist as an economically successful democracy and have 10% of our population at this kind of risk? And if you're a member of certain vulnerable populations in the US, even if you have the same health insurance, your lifespan can be radically reduced. For example, if you have serious mental illness, your lifespan on average with schizophrenia is 35 years less than it would have been based upon an insurance table without that diagnosis of schizophrenia. The same thing at a lower level applies to other mental illnesses, and research is beginning to show that the entire LGBTQ population has a somewhat lower survival rate in the United States. We've still got a long way to go. So how are we different? Well, for one thing, even though we require research as part of what our faculty does, overall, if you look at the percentage of output of the faculty and where the budgets go and so on, the 55 DO schools are devoted primarily to your education. It's what we're about. We're devoted primarily to the education of students. For better or for worse, research has a lesser role. The AOA and the COCA spend less of their attention and regulation on research space and research time allocation than does the Liaison Committee for Medical Education, the parallel body at the AMA. Over the course of my career, I've had the challenge and the opportunity to serve as both a consultant and a reviewer, and sometimes even with the mantle of a regulator, going to medical schools of both types and taking a look at what they're doing. And I had the opportunity in the last few years to go to one of the new emerging allopathic medical schools and get a tour as part of the activity that I was undertaking that day. And I walked in, and right on the ground floor, there was like a half a basketball court, maybe even a little bigger, of those chemistry type tables, soapstone tables with a little water thing and a gas thing. And there was plastic over them, and the plastic was tied at the bottom like it was inside of something permanent. And there was dust on the chairs and no water in the sinks. And I'm saying, what's this all about? Well, said the dean of that school, if we didn't have this half an acre of empty research space, LCME wasn't going to let us start. I said, are you going to hire faculty to fill this space? Well, we may eventually, but we actually have to get the teaching faculty on board first. And when they make us, we'll probably hire some people doing some basic science research. But we have to have the space, and we have to have a plan, and we have to have those folks built in, regardless of whether we want to or not. Overall, the DO programs create a lesser total community cost burden per graduate because we're focusing on the education of the students. And that doesn't mean that we don't do spectacularly successful basic science research. But we've got a balance that's different than the balance that other schools may have. We also have higher primary care percentages, which, as you know, is what America needs the most at this time. And There was recently a very strong article that was published showing that the new allopathic schools, as opposed to new osteopathic schools, the new allopathic schools are producing subspecialists. Most of the time when the new allopathic schools come on board, they sell the legislature about how they're going to produce a lot of primary care. And at least to some extent, many of them don't produce a lot of primary care in the long run. Our primary care numbers overall as a percentage are shrinking, as a raw number are going up because of all our new schools, and we're way ahead of others in the primary care that we're producing. So let's talk a little more about what's unique. Well, osteopathic manipulative medicine is basically based on the concept of viscerosomatic and somatovisceral reflexes. What we find on the outside tells us what's going on the inside, and what we do on the outside can affect what's happening on the inside. You won't get any argument from anybody on the viscerosomatic side. I mean, everybody knows about pain in your wrist from cardiac problems and muscle spasms away from where the areas that are actually hurting. And yeah, you got a gallbladder problem, you can feel it in your back and all that stuff. But where it's a little more contentious is in the somatovisceral side. However, in recent years, there's been good research both inside and outside the osteopathic profession demonstrating that somatovisceral change with somatic stimulation is real, and that you can see changes in gastric motility, micturition, contraction of the bladder, adrenal medullary function, heart rate, blood pressure, stuff that Dr. Degenhardt has supervised at KCOM and Dr. Heath has done at SOMA, as well as research outside of the osteopathic profession, has shown that we have some very strong arguments for the physiology that we posited before we were able to prove any of the things that we are now able to prove. But despite this emerging evidence of somatovisceral interaction and somatic influence on visceral function, we need to do more trials in this area, and they need to be highly objective trials. We've got something that we know, and we've got something that we need to prove. But don't lose heart about that. We were giving statins to lower cholesterol for 30 years before we really had proof that we were prolonging life and avoiding heart attacks by doing what we were doing. So this is not a surprising situation, but we have to work very hard or we won't get these types of clinical trials done. There's an obvious role for osteopathic manipulative medicine in dealing with the opioid crisis, because we know that what we do adjunctively can relieve pain. I know that less pain and prescription of fewer pain meds will help my patient to do better, be more functional, and have less risk of getting hooked on opioid medication. But we need to prove this assertion by doing controlled studies. This one is a big deal right now. There's a lot of opioid money out there. There's a lot of opioid treatment that needs to be evaluated, and we need to do a much better job in helping people through their pain and their discomfort, both by increasing and enhancing their physiology before things happen, and also working hard afterward to make sure that our patients get the kind of care that only we can deliver. But is this argument sufficient to keep MDs and DOs, and by apart, I don't mean apart, I mean separated in terms of the professions? There is more. You know, our profession is based on a few very solid concepts, first articulated by Dr. Still and refined by the wonderful researchers like Dr. Snyder, who have worked so hard since that time. The body's a unit. The person is a unit of body, mind, and spirit. We know that the body can self-regulate, self-heal, and maintain health, and structure and function are reciprocally interrelated. And the best treatment plans are based on this understanding of these principles that the body is a unit and self-regulatory and the interrelationship. This is what we're all about. Everybody will endorse these principles as generally okay, but they're not as nearly committed to them as our students and our residents are after you spend 4 years being inspired by your clinical faculty. And that's the difference that's worth keeping, worth saving as the osteopathic profession, because it's a unique contribution to American medicine. Because in the long run, we may have the answers that'll actually help save American medicine, but we're going to need a lot of help in getting that done. In a sense, even though Dr. Still articulated in 1892 the principles of osteopathic medicine and KCOM gets founded and we launch, the power that we have really is coming from the numbers that we're generating now. So let's take a quick look at the revolutions in American medicine. Abraham Flexner goes around and looks at the kind of preceptorship-based, disorganized medical training, and around the turn of the century says, wait a minute, we got to do a better job with this. And we have a kind of post-Flexnerian revolution that leads to science-based medical education. Medical schools become post-Flexnerian and somewhat more objective in the way in which they train and do research. Then a medical student named Jack Geiger goes to South Africa in 1957 and comes back and says, you know what, even in that horrible environment, Sidney and Emily Clark are starting clinics there, and they have this brilliant idea that if you actually look at the community and figure out what the community needs, you can tailor primary care to what the community needs. And in so doing, you can actually put the services where they're needed and build teams that can do a better job and have a better outcome, and everybody gets better because you've been doing that. And that little spark came back and created the community health center movement in the United States. And right now, you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 organizations, 1,450 organizations, 4,400 delivery sites that are actually providing care this year to 29 million patients, America's safety net. And the community health centers, by the way, are about the only bipartisan health program that's really supported by all aspects of our government. And they get their grants renewed every cycle, doing very, very well, because this is the safety net that's providing the care that nobody else will provide. It happens to be close to my heart because SOMA is working in that space much of the time, but it has been, I think, overall, a very important part of the whole concept of medical homes and the concept of community-based care. The revolution that Dr. Still started in 1892, which is really taking hold, it's kind of a slow revolution, taking hold more now, is the idea that patient-driven, holistic, socially determined care, in other words, you're talking to me and I'm listening, is the way in which we are going to get out of the bind that we're in, where we're economically inefficient and it's so costly to provide even basic care in the United States. The ultimate success in the work that you guys are going to be doing as you move into the future is going to depend on a true partnership between you and your patients and the community, among the three of you, so that ultimately success is going to depend on your helping people to take charge of their own health care. We don't have a great batting average in the United States. For the last 35 years, we've had about a 35%, 30% smoking quit rate. Half the people who need blood pressure control don't have it. 70% of our population have unprotected sex with a regular partner, and half have unprotected sex in irregular encounter type situations. And by the way, the Reader's Digest for about 25 years did a poll that asked the following question of college graduates: true or false? I can tell when I'm sitting next to somebody in a bar whether they're likely to have a sexually transmitted disease. 62% colon cancer screening, 60% mammograms, and 83% immunized for DPT. And by the way, the number to have true herd immunity is 95%, not 83%. But what Dr. Still has told us is that the patient possessing a mind, a body, and a spirit needs to be in charge, with our job being to provide the best available evidence and support for what the patient wants. So we're talking about what we call team-based, patient-centered, evidence-based care. And somehow we need to work our way through this steal of 49,300 new primary care providers by 2030. That's a heck of a lot. And for you, we keep telling you about the doctor-patient relationship and how important it is. And yet we're building systems right now that essentially separate you from that patient to some extent, because you're going to see them less frequently. So if you see a 40-year-old patient, you're in primary care, and you're in team-based practice of some sort, and that patient has essential hypertension, and they're 40 years old, they don't have much else going on, you're likely to give them a prescription, and you may not see them for a year or two, because their refills are going to be handled by others, pharmacist, PA, nurse practitioner. That's not really building a relationship. So what's going to happen is you're going to develop that relationship with the sicker and more complex patients. So what's going to happen is that you're going to spend your time with the patient who has type 2 diabetes, hypertension, early renal failure, atrial fibrillation, and hep C. And you're going to have to work with that patient to make sure that they get the medication and the lifestyle modification and the careful and intensive work necessary to get them through the difficulties that they have. And so your title essentially in this team-based future, even in the broad area of primary care, is that you'll be a complexivist. The same thing is going to be true in most of the specialties. If you're a cardiologist, your cardiology PA may be seeing many of your patients even without you, and you'll be seeing the ones who have the atrial fibrillation and the hypertension and maybe an irregularity of another sort that's making their life more complicated. Maybe one valve's a little wonky or whatever. They're the ones you're going to be spending your time with. That's what the numbers game is going to do for you folks. Despite all this expansion, you're still going to be facing a physician deficit. But one thing you know, it's guaranteed high income employment. And I guess that's a good thing. But don't claim that we're doing the best job with our money. Here's a chart that looks at not health care, but healthcare finance. And by the way, you are aware that all this debate that they're having about healthcare is not about healthcare. Medicare for all and all the rest of it, it's about money. It's about how much money we're going to spend and who's going to get it and where it's going to come from, not about delivering the healthcare. That's your job, and they haven't even started on that. They talked about value-based care for the last 20 years, and nobody has yet really developed a real understanding of what it means to have value-based care. I think it has to do with people being happy and living a long and happy life, but that may be just too simplistic. But take a look at this chart. We're the guys in green. We're the bottom line. So we're spending over $8,000 a head for healthcare expenditure. And you can see to the left of that, all of the countries, which is basically all of the countries in the civilized world, who are spending less than we do and have a higher life expectancy. Now, a life expectancy number is not necessarily the same thing as quality of life, but when you get to the gross number for the whole population, it's a pretty good proxy measure. And you can see here that even as a rich, rich country, we are spending more, and at least in this parameter, getting less than all those other guys. Well, let's look at it in terms of our gross domestic product. Here we are, healthcare spending. We're the red line on top. We're at 16% of GDP. United Kingdom and all the other folks are down there quite a bit lower. The interesting thing about that gap between our number and the other number is all those other people are also manufacturing cars. We're spending more on the steel, more on the healthcare than we are on the steel in a General Motors car. And the GM unions that are on strike right now are looking for more in the way of healthcare benefits. So these car companies are having to compete not only on where they can buy steel, but where they can buy health care. And no wonder they're a little frustrated. Just look at that number. We're spending twice as much, 16% and rising as a percentage of our gross domestic product. That gap is economically untenable with respect to all of the other kinds of economic areas that our country is involved in. And at the same time, that's happening, we're trying to compete in all those other economic areas. So this is something that's going to need some fixing, and it's going to affect a lot of what we do going forward. So where do we fit as DOs? Well, we provide what I call high-tech humanism. You're getting the best education that anybody can get with respect to the care that you're going to deliver. It's a wonderful education. You're getting all the high-tech stuff, but we also focus more naturally on social determinants, and we are clearly leaders in speaking that language from day one of your medical school. And that's not a minor thing. It's really probably the salvation of both our profession and the country. So what do we need to do? Well, number one, we need to stay on top of the emerging technology, but not let it run us. The medical Internet of Things, you've got to understand what's going on there. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Things like blockchain that are going to lead to a distributed, technologically advanced, very democratized, easily accessible set of information so that finally you're going to be able to have somebody walk in, give you a code, and you'll unlock their entire health record. When you come to apply to a hospital, primary source verification will be giving somebody a code and having them unlock a clearly articulated set of primary sources so that you won't spend months trying to get all your documents together. Artificial intelligence is going to help you. Some of the things you're going to have to remember to pass boards, you won't have to remember going forward. Not going to do you a lot of good in 2 years, but in the future, you're going to be more about how do I reason than how can I remember. We hope that that's the way it's going to be immediately. It's going to take some time to really get there. We need to understand team-based integrated care. We need to maintain our special skill in neuromusculoskeletal management and make the hard choices to get the kind of targeted studies that we need. Please don't give up on the physiology now that we have the tools that are available to really understand what's happening on a tissue level, on a submicroscopic level. Things that we posited, for example, 55 years ago, we were told about the trophic function of nerves and the fact that there had to be something going the other way down the nerve as well as up the nerve to the central nervous system. And slowly but surely became obvious that that was absolutely correct. Doctor Still knew what he was talking about. We need to be the branch of healthcare that truly understands that patient-driven care is the key and that we are the advocate for the patient. So I want to get specific about some of the technology just a little bit. Right now, when we're teaching you about medication, we've taught you about evidence-based practice. We'll teach you about evidence-based practice, sensitivity, specificity for the medicine, for the tests. By the way, the reason that I'm here instead of there is that despite the fact that my wife, and I have her permission to mention this, despite the fact that my wife had an MRI that showed no sign of a complete tear of her tendon in her shoulder, and she was going in for a quick little tweaking, and boom, that would have been done. Negative MRI, but when the clinician goes in and looks, there's a complete tear of the tendon. She has to have a major surgery to fix the rotator cuff. You know about the sensitivity and specificity like it's the fine print. Well, the fine print becomes the real world when something like that happens, and you have a much more significant situation in front of you. But medication, same thing. We know the medication works. We know the side effects. We know when it shouldn't be used. We know how to diagnose the problems that occur with the medication. And we're beginning to become slaves to the wearable technology as if it had some magic that exempts it from problems in sensitivity, specificity, applicability, et cetera. We still need to take an evidence-based approach to that wearable technology. So when somebody puts on a glucose monitor that's connected to an insulin pump, what's the chance that it's going to misread the blood sugar level and provide my patient with too much or too little? Same thing will apply to heart rate monitors that are connected to other kinds of equipment, maybe even things that will affect the cardiac rhythm. These are serious considerations. The FDA isn't doing an awful lot about it, but in your training, you need to be very careful that you understand that just because something is a machine doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% accurate, and your clinical judgment and your clinical awareness and your paranoia to make sure that what you're seeing is what you're getting is going to be very important in protecting your patients. So to be an authentic, high-quality physician, you need to look at complex situations, gain clarity, have the insight, determine a course of action, and you need to not be afraid to speak up. There are two ways that you, as a young physician, or even as a medical student, need to be able to speak up. Number one is everybody's job is patient safety. And if you see something, you need to say something. Doesn't mean that you go in there while the attending is taking care of the patient, tear the stethoscope out of their hand and say, "You did that wrong." That's a career-limiting move. But if you see that people are going into a room and not washing their hands or not doing something that the patient really needs to have done in an appropriate and professional way, you need to be able to ask the question respectfully and say, you know, I understood that hand washing was very important in not spreading C. diff from one room to the next. Could we maybe do something about hand washing? Don't sit on the sidelines and ask others to do things that you're unwilling to do yourself. And secondly, if you see something going on that you think you have an answer to, don't be afraid to speak up and provide that answer. and have the integrity to do the things that you say you're going to do, we will rely on you, and you'll find that the clinicians for whom you're working will come down incredibly hard on you for things that maybe in your undergraduate career didn't appear to be that important. Showing up on time, if you say you're going to do something overnight, doing it and delivering that information the next day, you'll find that the clinicians who have been inside the medical community doing the things that they needed to be doing over a long period of time will be incredibly concerned about your professionalism if you don't do the things that you say you're going to do, the assignments that you have accepted. It's all different now. It's not about getting a C on a paper. It's about somebody else's life hanging in the balance. And you never know when that person's life is going to hang in the balance. There are no minor tasks. When you do a history and physical, you don't know what little piece of information might be critically important. Oh, the person remembers an allergic reaction to X, and you later find out that drug Y is related to drug X, you just saved a life. You never know what's important, but you do know that you better do with integrity and initiative everything that you're asked to do from this point forward. So during the next 50 years, as you take over, you've got a solid philosophy and osteopathic principles. Your practice is going to involve the social determinants, high-tech Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, virtual presence. Your first visit with a patient may in fact be a virtual visit, despite the fact that you want to be high touch in what you do. We've got to do a lot more haptic research, but there will still be times where that virtual presence is the only way you can get the job done. The outcomes we're looking for: equitable care and coverage, respect, self-determination, and in my view, the science of happiness. After all, what are we doing this for? We're doing this so that our patients, as my grandmother said, should live and be well. That's really what it's all about. And that's what our osteopathic philosophy is aimed at, helping people to live and be well. American medicine cannot survive without us. EO education and clinical care are the best value proposition in the United States. And your training makes you the best doctor for the future, especially if you understand and articulate the osteopathic differences. America's healthcare future is indeed up to you. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm trying to get the control back up so I can see you folks. Thank you all very much. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schwartz. We actually have time for questions. So if there are students that would like to ask questions, I think we actually have questions ability in the other rooms as well. But if you have any questions. Wow, Dr. Schwartz was so thorough. You guys now understand your role in the future profession. Well, Dr. Schwartz, if you were here, I would be handing you this plaque.
I can see it.
Can you see it?
Thank you.
We so appreciate you joining us by Zoom, even though you're taking care of your wife right after surgery. So we really appreciate it, and thank you so very much. For our students, we actually have Evening with the Stars as part of the Founders Day event. You guys are not required to come, but you are welcome to come, and you get to work with physicians from all over the country if you'd like, including Dr. Eric, who is going to be talking about the fascial distortion model. So you are all welcome, but it's not required. But thank you guys for all being here, and thank you again, Dr. Schwartz. We really appreciate your inspirational talk to our students.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much, Dr. Snyder. At least I know I will see you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.